Our speaker today is going to be Scott Brooks. Scott is a partner and the vice president of consulting at OrgVitality. He has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and, in fact, is a fellow with the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, SIOP, and working with clients, has found himself many, many times in the position of needing to tell stories about data, stories about results. With that, I am going to turn it over to Scott.
Thanks, Jared. Delighted to be here. I think storytelling is one of my favorite topics. It was actually one of my favorite chapters to write in a book I co-wrote with Jeffrey Saltzman, our CEO, called Creating the Vital Organization. And what we want to start with first is, what's the power of a story? Whether we've thought about it explicitly or not, we all know intuitively that stories connect us. They help us share ideas, goals, and values. They captivate, they educate, they inspire. And within an organization, the stories bind people together. They humanize leaders, they motivate employees. And this is really the focus of this webinar. And in fact, one of my favorite definitions of organizational culture is it's the stories that people tell when you're not in the room or when leaders are not in the room. Now, over the past decade, 15 years, we all know that storytelling has been increasingly and formally recognized as an important part of organizational life. There's even job titles out there called chief storyteller, but it's always been important. And I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to take us back, time machine, to the 1980s. And some of us may remember Van Halen, big hair, spandex, David Lee Roth's acrobatic jumps, and brown M&Ms. Now, some of you might remember that Van Halen, uh, you might remember them as the M&M divas. Now, these rock stars were classic partiers in that rock and roll 1980s era. And there was, in fact, a contractual clause that began in their 1982 world tour, where they needed a bowl of M&Ms in their dressing room with all the brown ones removed. And everybody reported that they would throw a great big full-blown rock and roll trash the place tantrum if this wasn't there, or if there were brown M&Ms still in the bowl. And it's true. That was a clause in one of their contracts. But there's a deeper truth, a more interesting truth to that rider in the contract that said there will be no brown M&Ms in the backstage area upon pain of forfeiture of the show with full compensation. So what's the truth behind this? What's the deeper story? Well, Van Halen's concerts were some of the first mega concerts in the rock and roll era. The stage sets were hugely complex with intense electrical and structural demands, and mistakes could result in show mishaps or delays, or even hurting people with collapsing beams or electrical overloads might occur. Now, back in the early 80s, the typical rock band hauled around 3 tractor trailers worth of gear and equipment. Van Halen's concerts required 9. And so with all this and with all the things that they had to set up with rules like suspending light fixtures, light gear, no less than 30 feet, but no more than 37.5 feet above the stage surface. Lots of technical kinds of things. So how could you ensure that setup crews, which were different in each town, read all the specs correctly and set everything up properly? Van Halen's solution was the brown M&Ms. So buried deep in this set of rules, they had this guideline, this strict rule about the brown M&Ms. And so they would come in, if they saw brown M&Ms, they would step back and say, we got to check everything because there's certainly a mistake. So this was really a genius metric. And it makes for a great story, but it also makes for a great story underneath the real story. And so with this, I'm going to illustrate some things about storytelling. First is that we think in generalities, but we live in detail. And this was partly the challenge of Van Halen's setups. There was so much detail that they had to work through that they needed to elevate to the level of just a simple M&M story of what was happening. This is also one of the challenges with many OE interventions, change management, or leaderships of bigger organizations. And we think and talk in concepts and generalities and maybe data, but we live in detail. We want the storyline, we want the narrative, and so forth. So enter stories. And, we're in the middle of a new Marvel movie that's been released. It's almost earned about $1 billion already. That's the new Spider-Man movie. And Marvel movies are certainly some of the biggest stories in the air these days, having earned well over $30 billion. And so I'm going to drill into that a minute and say, when we think about stories, let's think about superhero origin stories. What are the two parts of the best stories? First one is what makes them super. Okay. What is this? How do they get their powers? Why are they strong? Why do they fight? And the second is what makes them heroes, right? Why do they do good in the world? What drives them to do what they do, and so forth? Or if they're a villain, what causes them to try for world domination? So we can take Spider-Man, for example. Those of you who know the story, he was a high school kid who developed his abilities, the super part, after being bitten by a radioactive spider or a genetically modified spider, depending on the movie adaptation you might be familiar with. But he was a hero because he was driven by his guilt over his Uncle Ben's murder that he might have prevented, and from the moral and human center that his Aunt May provided. So these are two different parts of Superman, and sometimes those conflict, but it makes for a great character and a great origin story. And while the concept of the super might draw you in, it's his personal mission and his character arc that keeps you interested. So that's superheroes, fine. But what else can we talk about? Well, what about the two parts of a good organization origin story? You can think about it this way. What makes them super? How do organizations succeed? What are their competencies? What are they good at? Where do they beat the competition? What can an organization do that no other organization might do? And there's also what makes the organization a hero. It's like, why do they do what they do? Organizations can choose to go left and right. They could choose to develop one product over another. They could choose a market over another. All of these things relate to the mission, right? Why are organizations doing what they do, not just what are they good at? And so you could think about these two sides of an origin story, kind of like the super and the hero for superheroes. And think about it for your own organization. What is it that makes you super? Why are you good? And what makes you a hero? Why do you do what you do? Um, so at OrgVitality, we tell stories from data all the time. And one frequent way we cast it is exactly this. What are you good at? And sort of a current performance kind of a thing. And why do you do what you do, which helps to guide future potential and performance. And that's really, by the way, our definition of what vitality is. I'm going to move from this sort of intro set of examples into the discipline of storytelling. It's worth unweaving a little bit. Now, many people would say that they would only tell stories if they knew any good ones. And let's reject that as a hypothesis. What is really true, and a better way to think about it in a concise way, is this: stories happen to those who can tell them. That this, might have been said by many people. It's most commonly ascribed to Ira Glass, who's the host of the podcast on National Public Radio in the United States called This American Life. And what is the point of this? Think about the people that you know around you. It's often the same people who are always telling the stories. Now, it's less likely that they magically have more interesting things that happen to them, And it's more likely that they notice and can recount things in a compelling way. So this is really the first step. It is worth learning how to tell stories better. And so once you learn to tell, the content will come. So what are some of the basic areas of content, of story content that you can look for? Here's some stories that are often told in business. Origin stories, we kind of talked about this one. Nature of our challenge, why is what we're doing unique or important? The striving to improve story, how do we improve? How do we overcome? The coming together story, bonding as people despite our differences. Performance tales, triumph stories like how the value of Post-it notes were originally met with skepticism when they were invented at 3M until the clever inventors got 3M's own administrative assistants hooked. Then they cut off supply, right? That's how they convinced them that Post-it notes were actually a viable, marketable thing. Um, we also have how the organization took care of employees, not just the stated, but the demonstrated values of the organization. And then, of course, the where are we going? Not just predicting, but defining the future. Um, one fun origin story, and we always love them. One in business is there's a fellow named Earl Bakken who founded Medtronic, that you might know is a great Minnesota company that makes implantable medical devices and other things. But back in 1957, there was a blackout and snowstorm in the Twin Cities, and one child on a pacemaker had died because pacemakers had to be plugged into the wall at the time. So there was a Dr. C. Watson Lillyhigh who asked Earl if he could solve the problem. Earl went off and he found a circuit diagram for a metronome in Popular Electronics, and he made a battery powered, a clicker basically from it. And it was the first external pacemaker design. And he showed it to the doctor and went away to sort of improve upon it, but came back the next day and was shocked to see that the doctor had already implanted it inside a patient and it was already in use. And by the way, the FDA didn't regulate these kinds of things until 1976. That is a great origin story. It's got compassion. It's got why are we good? It's also got why are we a hero? Because there's children and we're saving lives, and that's awesome. Um, so pick a topic, listen for stories, and you will get better. We want to talk now about what makes for a good story, what makes it more effective, what makes it successful. And I'm going to be bouncing between different storytellers, what you might say in your own jobs and how you might talk about things and data, if that's your job and so forth, but also what leaders might say. Or what the organization might say about leaders. So all of these are stories to be thinking about, and all of these are things that we're going to be bouncing around doing. Um, so let's go into what I think are some of the best fundamentals, particularly of leaders telling stories. Um, there was a fellow veteran Hollywood filmmaker named Peter Gruber who distilled this into 4 truths of the storyteller for a business leader. The first is truth to the teller. And I love this characterization where Gruber says the storyteller's tongue, feet, and wallet must move all in the same direction. So this is not just walk the talk, it has to do with the money. Do you spend precious resources that are consistent with what you're saying and what you're doing? And anyway, these are some of the most potent stories we tell about decisions that cost us money, but pursue some value that is more important, like employee safety or integrity with customers and so forth. So, as we're talking here, think in your head about when would your leaders sacrifice profits for a larger goal? Or when would you sacrifice money or time or effort in pursuit of something bigger? That's a huge storytelling opportunity. And leaders may never know storytellers directly, but they know leaders through the stories that they tell. So, there's one to illustrate this. There's one healthcare president in the southeastern United States I was talking to, and she was expressing some dismay over an item about employee survey item about how much management used good employees' ideas or not. And she said, they just don't know how much they keep me awake at night. And that simple statement drifted out of the conference room and into more general awareness, and it helped humanize that president. And it credibly reflected a truth of the teller. Second is truth to the audience. Compelling stories start with what the audience values and cares about, not what the top leaders care about. Gruber tells an example of Sally Krawcheck, who held CEO positions at Smith Barney and a Citigroup unit, and was known as someone who drew people in. And one example was citing the common bond of the awkward teenage years. And she said, there's nothing they could do to me at Salomon Brothers that was worse than the seventh grade. So if a leader starts by talking about something like that, they're humanized. There is some vulnerability, and it's also just sort of a compelling image. It's like, wow, what was happening to you in the seventh grade, and what was Solomon Brothers doing to you? And so you want to know the next kinds of things, and you're listening to the person, not just the facts and the figures. Another example, a contrast to this, is a president that I had known who would continually talk about the health of the organization in terms of the cash that they had accumulated and had available to devote to various business development efforts. Now, talking about cash is fine, but what the audience actually heard was the disconnect between how rich the organization was and the low wages that they were paid. The leader was starting with what was important to him and not the audience. And he separated himself from the audience in that way. So be thinking about that kind of a thing, and how often in your work have you seen that executives can be in a different place than employees, and the best ones don't let that be a barrier. They have a different experience, but they are able to connect still. Next is truth to the moment. Now, what this means is you don't want to just have a verbatim script or a regurgitated reflex, but the story that you're telling is powered by the passion in the moment. Now, clearly, stories can be told and retold and won't always be spontaneous. But even if you've heard it before, when a great storyteller is telling us a tale, you have the sense that it's not verbatim from a script or just plain regurgitated, but it's powered by a passion in that moment. There's a great example about how a leader might sometimes come in and say, you know what, I had these notes, but I'm going to set them aside and I'm going to tell you something that I've been thinking about. That grabs you. It feels like you're special in the moment, and it feels like it's true. The last here is truth to the mission, that the story must echo something larger than one story or one storyteller. And so it needs to be clear that the leader is devoted to a cause that's larger than him or herself. And so origin stories, told by founders are so compelling because the launch of a business is often synonymous with that entrepreneurial passion to create something that didn't exist before. And it's often the story of an underdog that somehow beat the odds, duct tape and paperclip solution that actually worked. You get to hear the emotional backdrop. Now, not all mission stories are success stories. Not all tellers are part of an origin story, but there's ways to figure out if you are devoted to something larger than themselves. Now, we've been talking about big, maybe stories that leaders tell, but I want to be clear that stories are not just grand, sweeping narratives. Not all stories are told on stage. I had the good fortune a number of years ago to meet Masa Tanaka, who at the time was a president and CEO of Union Bank. It was owned by a Japanese larger organization, but the bank itself was based out of California. And he, as a Japanese expat running a US company, he knew that he needed to stay calibrated with the voice of the employees. And often when a an executive or an employee came to speak with him, he had this rubber ear that he would pull out of his desk and hold it up to his ear. And picture an individual here with a very serious face, hard to read expression, holding up a giant rubber ear against his head. It humanized him, it humanized the moment. And he would open his eyes a little wider as if he were listening. And he was making a point that he had to listen. And he was not just listening, he was reminding the whole organization, he was reminding other executives that they needed to listen as well. And it created a lasting image. And people would say, gosh, have you seen Masa's ear? That's an opener. And so Masa helped shape the stories around him. And so it helped illustrate a point that's going to be reverberating through this webinar, which is, what do you want employees or leaders to say about you or about your data? Or what do leaders want others to say about them when they're not in the room? How do you get others telling stories about the things that are important? That's fantastic. Along with the ear, this is my sidebar, and I am going to do a quick metaphorical sidebar on metaphors, and a couple of them. Maybe you already have thought about these, but New Year's resolutions. When you need to work on something and measurement helps, but you kind of already know what you want to work on, like standing on a scale New Year's Eve, I got to lose 10 pounds. The New Year's resolution metaphor is a great one for change in organizations, a great comparison. And the science of keeping New Year's resolutions is remarkably similar to that of the science of organizational change. Commitments, goals, plans, coping strategies, buddy system. Look it up. It's hard to tell the differences sometimes. Second, engagement is like gas in the tank. An empty tank will prevent movement, but a full tank is no guarantee. And so you think about, gosh, what is engagement power for you? The unique bits about your organization really isn't the gasoline. Gasoline is one of the most generic things across cars. But it's the engine that gets you where you need to go. It's the engine that creates unique value for you. Last quick metaphor is HR is like a personal trainer. It's not a personal trainer's job to do sit-ups for you. It's not HR's job to do your work for you or to create your own survey action plan or whatever it is that you're trying to do. But HR's job is to be a coach, a champion, a guide, and to support and to help you live up to your own good intentions. So the value of metaphors like these or Masa's ear is that we remember them. And they convey a richer message than a simple statement would. They connect ideas that we think about and mull over, and we advance those ideas farther than the original storyteller that brought up this metaphor. You can lean into the whole personal trainer thing, for example, and come up with what it means to you, and it will be richer in that way. So I'm going to start moving from this to how we tell stories and how we drive a message that hopefully gets retold. And I'm going to move into a couple of elements from literature, specifically melodrama and character arc. And understanding some of this might help us tell our own stories better within organizations. First, melodrama. You've experienced this, I'm 100% sure, where there's certain parts of stories or what people are talking about where everything is urgent, critical, it's a must win, it's a burning platform. And sometimes this is manufactured urgency from fear rather than compelling opportunity. You find yourself playing defense, not offense. And interestingly, the research suggests that fear motives um, are motivating to be sure, but they're better at motivating inaction or rigidity than they are at motivating action or creation. And in fact, it's hope that motivates action and creation more than fear. That's more sustaining, and that's where we want to be. So, what's the tip? We want to ignite passions and join together by articulating compelling and audacious goals. And a couple of examples for this. The movie Miracle, that actually was a true recounting of the United States men's hockey team that won gold in the 1980 Winter Olympics, and they defeated Russia. That was a defining moment. At a critical moment in the movie, the coach Herb Brooks, no relation to me, said, "Tonight we are the greatest hockey team in the world. You were born to be hockey players, every one of you. You were meant to be here tonight. This is your time." That was a pulling together kind of example. Almost the same message. There's a famous ex-CEO of Alcoa named Paul O'Neill who gave his maiden speech to shareholders. And he said, if you want to understand how Alcoa is doing, you need to look at our workplace safety figures. If we bring injury rates down, it won't be because of the cheerleading or nonsense that you sometimes hear from other CEOs. It will be because the individuals at this company have agreed to be part of something important. They've devoted themselves to creating a habit of excellence. Safety will be an indicator that we're making progress and changing habits across the entire institution. That's how we should be judged. That's pretty cool. I would have wanted to work for that guy. Um, but note that with safety as a topic, he could have gone defense. He could have gone into danger and fear, but instead he was talking about coming together to be part of something important, and that's how we're going to be judged. That's pretty awesome. You can also go and find President Kennedy's speech about launching the moonshot, right? The putting a man on the moon. And he talked more about that as an opportunity than the Cold War plans or the Cold War fear that certainly was gripping the nation at that time. So, talk about melodrama. Let's talk about character arc. Now, our favorite stories show how protagonists change. What happens here? Well, you want a goal, you can't get a goal, you act to get the goal, and then maybe you end up the story with changed attitudes about the goal. And these are the most impactful stories. And so I'm going to give you some examples, but think about this in terms of leadership wanting a goal, trying to get there, maybe changing in the end their opinions about what the goal should be or refining what it is. But whether it's something like Mulan, where it's a Disney story that starts with an I wish song, like The Wizard of Oz does, reflecting what the protagonist really wants. And that's the whole character arc in one song. Um, but it's great. I love this movie. It's about a young woman who, yeah, she saves China, but the main arc is about how her outer self reflects her inner self, right? So her goal changes. Or Luke Skywalker, famously reflecting Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and is transformed from that orphan boy who's sort of outside the action looking in and wants excitement, but learns about powers he didn't have, reconciles with the legacy of his father. Not to be confused with Harry Potter, but it works. Pride and Prejudice is about overcoming just that in the main characters. Iron Man, more than just an action movie because we invest in Tony Stark's change, or Groundhog Day plays with all of this, where the day itself doesn't change. And in fact, Bill Murray's protagonist is the only thing that does change, which makes it a great vehicle. And then, of course, classics like It's a Wonderful Life, where there's a major reflection and epiphany about his own life. So the most impactful organization stories will similarly show human transformation, where leaders might say, here's what I wish I had known, or this is what I thought was important, but now we know better. And that's all about learning and growing together. So all of this is about stories in general. And you want to tell your own stories, but the real impact is in the stories other people tell when you're not in the room, or that people tell when leaders are not in the room. And this is where we really want to live. We want other people telling stories. What will people talk about when you're gone? If you're in delivering a presentation to executives and then you disappear, what are they going to be talking about on the next break? Your stuff or something else? And so let me give you a couple of points about helping other people tell stories. First, research says people who tell stories are more committed to the organization. That's fantastic. That suggests that the stories that are told tend to be more pro than anti organization. right? We all know stories about like, sort of gossipy kinds of things about something that went wrong. But because people are more committed, it reflects this underlying desire to make things better. It also suggests that you can help these people tell their own stories. And you can develop a storytelling discipline within your own organization. Kind of like that quote by Ira Glass, the stories happen to people who can tell them. And you can do that by encouraging listening, repeating stories, and everything like that are in and around you that your employees tell or your leaders tell. And but underneath it all, like any skill, is practice. One way to help spawn stories, if you are able to in your organization, is to create events that spawn them. And whether this can be in the wake of an employee survey as part of what's going on, and many of these things were that I'm going to reference here, but let me just give you a couple of examples about events that get people talking. A lot of times there's an innovation award in different organizations, but for something that's succeeded and become wonderful. But lame duck awards reward grand failures in innovation, things that we thought would have worked well, but wound up wasting time and money in the end. But the process was valuable because innovation does not always succeed, and we know that. Another one, coffin at a town hall meeting. I was actually at this town hall meeting a long time ago where top executives were inscribing in scraps of paper practices they themselves and others around them were pledging to stop, and then they threw them in a coffin. Then they took the coffin out into the parking lot and burned it. This was great, by the way. It helped create buzz and so forth, but it really only works if there's follow through. This was a show, and it was a great show, but good shows need spending money and need a certain tenacity to be good. Next one, love this one. This was a client of mine a while back. Where it was a healthcare organization that got organized an afternoon before and then fanned out across every site they had, approached every employee who came to work that day and handed them a card and a piece of candy. And the card said, come up with an idea to improve patient care, customer service, and go tell your boss. So they didn't collect it. That would have bogged this whole thing down. But they got so much buzz and so much positive impact from it that a few years later they did it on patient safety, not just patient care. And if you want to go completely audacious, and this is from a while back in 1978, but Ross Perot was a guy who ran a company called EDS, and a couple of executives had been taken hostage by the Iranian government. And so Ross Perot tasked retired Colonel Bull Simmons. You can't name a character better than Bull in this particular case. They assembled a team of Vietnam vets from the workforce of this organization to help rescue the people. Now, we don't all have the ability, the wherewithal, the capacity to send an incursion behind enemy lines to create a story. But man, I mean, this was the tongue, the feet, and the wallet all moving in the same direction. And it really demonstrated value. Um, so, how do you create an environment where stories tell themselves? We can't charter a paramilitary incursion, but what else do we do? Um, where do you find something that speaks to a deep truth? If you look for it, you can find it. They exist in all organizations. But there's an important point I want to convey as we do this with stories. Um, there's a paradox here. Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, part of his moral center, said at one point, with great power comes great responsibility. And so if we become great at storytelling, we need to use this power responsibly because there's this paradox. And the paradox is fiction is great. Sometimes it's called the lie that tells the truth, where there's a fundamental human truth inside all great fiction, but it's fiction. It's not something that really happened. Um, and if you want to match that up, you can find that authenticity sometimes is emotional, not factual. And it's also true that stories work with, not against, cognitive biases and heuristic. Our brains are wired to make sense of the world in terms of narrative. And, if we remember a story better than we remember truth, that's like the availability heuristic. If you're got a psychology background, you're kind of familiar with it. It's the inclination to rate as more probable things that come more easily to mind. Or the conjunction fallacy is the tendency to give more weight to detailed explanations than to simple ones. And so we need to understand that as we tell stories, we're kind of leaning into cognitive biases and heuristics that may stray a little bit from what's journalistically true. This is the paradox. And so part of the Uncle Ben lesson here is use your powers for good. Tell stories that are correct, get the facts right, don't just wing it, make them grounded. And moving into what helps things be grounded, it's worth noting there's a tragic irony of any data field, that the cleanest stories are those unburdened by error rates and probabilistic statistical coefficients. Data can make us tentative or hesitant or maybe unclear because real world data is massive. And indeed, the people who are most certain are those without data. But as famous physicist Richard Feynman said, science, and I'm going to add, and data is what we do to keep us from lying to ourselves. So we persevere, we fight the good fight. We know that stories illuminate data, they make it easier for a listener to understand, but it takes a special kind of storytelling to convey the message of research, which can be foggy. And so let me use employee surveys to illustrate some examples of how to do some of this. First, we need a finding. Confidence in leadership declined 7 points and is now below benchmark. Leadership improved communication. All right, fine. We've probably all seen employee survey results like this. That's true. That's a finding, but we want to move from this to something like this. Employees understand the strategy. They're increasingly unsure that their decisions follow it. The gap is greatest among those managers who are, expected to translate those decisions from others. Sometimes we call this the director dip that can happen. Not really an awareness problem. It's a consistency and credibility problem. And so before launching more communications about our strategy, we got to identify where people see potential contradictions and how we've, resolved that by explaining, changing, or just acknowledging some of the trade-offs. So that's partly a story. And this example does a couple of things. It distinguishes evidence from interpretation. It identifies audience and sort of a protagonist. It has some tension, without melodrama. It directs attention towards a choice. And it doesn't claim that the survey proved why confidence declined. Right now, it's just talking about it. So, how do we do more and to build a story around this? How do we use this kind of thing? What do we do? Well, first, as mentioned, we got to ask the question, what do we learn? And you got to begin with validity, not storytelling. You got to know what you believe. And you got to know what you believe in a way that's credible and that you might stand up in front of a critical audience of your peers and say, I believe this, right? Doesn't have to be fully supported by data in every single step of the way, but you as an expert need to have a great interpretation that you genuinely believe and could defend. Once you have those conclusions, scientifically derived from your metrics and so forth, you got to consider the audience. And your listeners are likely to have different backgrounds, come from different disciplines. They may not accept the same technical foundations that drive your own validity, your own sense of validity. And they may need different kinds of evidence. Maybe evidence that you wouldn't find compelling, like single case studies rather than statistical coefficients. But you need to speak in the ways that they find compelling. And you may need to rebuild your deck and your story with them in mind, including generally maybe banishing all Greek letter statistical coefficients to an appendix or maybe even the cutting room floor. Um, yeah, the work of the stats is done once you have your story. Then you work on how to make it credible for everybody else. Next, you got to think about what's the human experience behind the result. So, to paraphrase Alfred North Whitehead from a while back in the webinar, we measure in generalities, but employees live in detail. And so, how do you translate the finding into sort of a grounded organizational life? And one way to do this is to convey the employee voice. Um, at OrgVitality, we have a really kind of cool way to look at text analytics, and AI generated summaries are great, but they can bury the voice and the personality and the fingerprints of real people. And one of our comment analytics tools can surface the most illustrative comments of a group that you're looking at. And this can become the important color commentary, not to substitute for the grounded finding, but to illustrate it. And you also got to ask the question, why does this matter? And the matter is, number one, connected to something your audience already cares about, starting with where they already are, not where you want them to go. Hopefully, your original survey design far upstream had that in mind, where your survey content covers topics that your audience is going to care about. But even without that, your job is still to take the results and match it up to what people care about. And so you don't want to say something like, "Oh, hey, engagement went down." You want to talk more about, the capability we need for the next phase of our strategy in, Latin America is becoming harder to mobilize. Our capability is becoming harder to mobilize there. That's a little bit more connected to what people already care about. And related to this, don't start at the logical beginning. Don't start with your methods and your analyses and so forth. Start with what they care about. Start with maybe a story. Think about TED Talks that are all very compelling. They always begin with a personal story to connect the storyteller to the audience. They don't start with, decades of research, and references and so forth. So sometimes you got to once you decide what your message is, you have to go back and redo your whole deck. And that might double the work, but it can more than double your impact. And when I say redo your deck, you are building the story that people care about the conclusions that you've already made and about the conclusions that are already valid. But it's more geared towards the audience. Then lastly here, draw upon evidence beyond the current project. Nobody makes decisions in a vacuum. And so you might need to understand and incorporate other kinds of things that your audience is already thinking about. For example, if you're giving a presentation that's part of a full day's agenda, do you know what happened just before and just after your talk? Do you know what the mindset is of people as you're going into it? Are you sandwiched between an update on regulatory issues and something else about channel expansion overseas, or what? And so you got to meet people where they are. Second couple of points about telling stories based in data. Clearly, what's the implication for action? What decisions do people face? Drive people towards action. And action can be communicating, changing, reinforcing, monitoring. Action doesn't have to be a full-on initiative all the time. But you also want to be understanding that science is probabilistic. Action is binary. And so one of the things that, my background is industrial and organizational psychology, and in a way we're trained to be risk averse. This issue tends to be related to that or is often, associated with this. But for action to happen, a causal assertion needs to be made. And often you are the person in the best place to make it. You may not have all the evidence needed, but to say, look, this is not going to be a waste of your time to act on something here. That's something you can say. Then retelling, what will help the story travel through the organization? What is the character arc? What would executives say they've learned? What do you hope managers will tell their teams? What will skeptics say was ignored? Or 6 months later, what story will be told about the organization's response? These are things that you can have in mind as these things are unfolding, as the original findings are being initially conveyed. And in fact, you can feed people their lines if you want. For example, in 6 months later, kind of story, it's less, hey, the organization launched an action plan to improve enablement. What does that mean? That's like laden with some lingo like enablement. That's not what people say when they walk through the hallways on a regular basis. But you could say instead, hey, employees through the survey, we know we all voiced the concern about priority changes that made it difficult to do high quality work. And so the leaders, they picked three things to stop, explain trade-offs, and they gave managers more clear authority to protect team capacity. If you can feed that kind of a thing, it is so much better than just having a list. And that's a little bit more of a story. So data alone is rarely going to inspire or drive action. Um, we know this. Heck, we can say that, the business case for quitting smoking has existed for decades, but people still smoke. So research alone ain't enough. Um, but we can absolutely ascertain that facts and figures might make you seem smart, according to the research, but stories are going to make you compelling. And so all this leads to the question for you. After you, let's say, deliver your survey presentation, after you deliver whatever message it is you're trying to make to whatever audience you just shared your message with, what are people going to remember once you leave the room? And this should be your main focus, not the deck that you leave behind. Um, and this can be daunting to think about, but it can also be liberating. And I'm going to get meta here for a second. Specifically, what would I want you to remember from this webinar next week? Without this deck, maybe you never refer to it again. But to be meta, I want you to remember the idea of people remembering what happens once the presentation is done. So if you can remember this point, I will be happy. And you can find me later and tell me if you remember it, even without the deck or unaided. As we wind up, just a little checklist that's going to be in the deck. I won't go through it too much, but you can look at this and start to say, all right, how good are we generally? How good am I generally about telling stories from data or just reinforcing what's around, and how much are stories in the air? So with that, we have some time for questions.
Here's an interesting one. There's a little bit to it. Can storytelling change organization culture? We've had a lot of change in our company, mostly new leaders, all changes for the good. But employees still tell a lot of old stories that are kind of negative. Can
Yeah.
storytelling help counter that?
Yeah, 100%. But it's got to be a story that's credible and about something that's happening and about the tongue, feet, and wallet, let's say, moving in the right direction. But the first thing I would say is stories are a definition of the culture, right? They can help change the culture, but if people are still telling the old stories, your culture hasn't changed. And the telling of the old stories reflects that. So it's not just a driver, it's a reflection.
Here's another one. Should storytelling, or perhaps strategic storytelling, be a leadership development program?
I firmly believe that storytelling is a skill that can be learned, and the sort of stories happen to people who can tell them type of way. And so we all want messages to be compelling. We all want messages to be memorable, whether it's having a big rubber ear in your desk, to help highlight things that people then talk about, or anything else. Yeah, 100%. Storytelling can be formalized in leadership development programs, and it's an integral part of communication. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, in fact, Scott, we recently helped a client
Hmm.
launch a multi-rater feedback program for leaders that they had have been putting through a storytelling skills development effort. And it's very interesting. It's something that just got underway. The first assessment is going on right now. Um, but I'll be really interested to see the kind of feedback folks are getting from that. When a new CHRO starts, what's a tip you have to match storytelling of current program, parentheses, the survey that happened before they came, to a new CHRO's direction?
Data is inherently retrospective. Action is inherently prospective, and that's, I think, the tension that you just highlighted with that question. So I would say that you know there's a lot of ways to characterize what's just happened in a survey. But part of the trick is learning where to focus and how to improve and what's important. And those last bits need to be coming from sort of the voice of a new CHRO or a new CEO or whatever it is. Um, there's real easy ways to sort of ask a CHRO, hey, we don't have data yet, but of all these questions, which ones intrigue you the most? What are you most looking forward to seeing in terms of results? And then see what they say and make the story connect to the kinds of things the CHRO would want to retell to the rest of the organization or retell to the executive leadership team. I love this topic. It's a big topic. There's a lot of ways to talk about it, and we've sort of danced through different ways to think about storytelling. But I would, if I were to leave you all with maybe 3 points, it's number one, listen for stories that are out there that you hear in the between now and the end of the week. Number two, figure out which of those stories are worth retelling, where it creates a constructive message. And so it's not just that you want people to retell your stories, it's you get to retell other people's stories. And then number three, and I mentioned this before, if there's one thing that you remember, this time next week unaided, it would be that um, when you leave a room uh, or leave a meeting, whatever it is, having just tried to convey something important, think about how you want people to remember that unaided in a week. And if your message is so complicated that it's hard to remember something unaided in 1 week, then rethink your message.
Thank you all again. We really appreciate your attending and have a great day.
Thank you very much.